Is it okay to judge others? Welcome to an original exploration of everyday moral dilemmas with philosopher Professor Clancy Martin and spiritual guide Daaji.
Today, we are going to be talking about one of the most difficult, one of the most challenging of our topics, which is the question of whether or not we have the authority to judge others, to decide whether what others are doing is right or wrong. One of the reasons this topic is so difficult is that we live in a time today where we are very hesitant to judge others, and that might be a good thing. We live in a time where we are suspicious of intolerance. That might be a very good thing. Times of great intolerance have tended to be very violent times. That said, in many ways, we live in just as intolerant a time as we've ever lived in. We seem to be constantly in disagreement with one another in our politics, in our social and cultural evolution. Lately, it's been very, very turbulent, not only in America, but in India and across the world. We're going through a time when we see deep disagreement about the most fundamental things. And a lot of those things come down to questions of value judgments we are making, value judgments about each other, about right and wrong ways to live. Now, the history of this in the Western tradition really starts with Socrates. And there's a wonderful dialogue written by Plato about his teacher Socrates, in which one of Socrates' acquaintances is hurrying off to the place in Athens, where the temple in Athens, where questions of justice are decided. He's decided he's going to press a case. So Socrates is interested to ask him, against whom are you bringing this case? And he replies, well, as it happens, Socrates, it's against my father. And Socrates says, wait, because of course, in ancient Greek society and in ancient Greek ethics, parents occupied a particular place, as we've talked about in an earlier discussion. Parents occupied a particular place of honor, and it was considered to be very odd indeed for a child to bring a case against a parent. And in fact, we consider that to be very odd indeed even today. And so Socrates says, my goodness, he must have really done something terrible in order for you to bring a case against your father, and you must really feel confident that you are right. And this is the first thing that we should bear in mind when we're thinking about this question of whether we have the moral right to judge others. And that is, do we have the confidence that we ourselves are in such a morally secure position that we have the capacity to judge other people, to decide whether they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, living the right life or the wrong life? Are we so certain that we are ourselves the best judges of that?
We judge others from our own point of view. But how can we ever be certain that we are right?
Well, so many others judge us too, isn't it? Are you always happy with their judging or judging about your family? You often wish that they better had an open mind and look at you with total clarity without any misunderstanding, isn't it? Now, turn the tables and ask yourself, while I can avoid judging others in my mind, Yet, how wonderful would it be to arrive at a clearer understanding about others? Who knows, while judging someone so close, you may lose a very caring soul, your soulmate. Then what will happen to your entire life for a simple folly of judging someone wrongly? My master, the great Babuji, proposed that philosophy is a subject not based on reason but intuition. It starts not from doubts but from wonder. In the Eastern tradition, we generally attend to philosophy by first going into life of practicality. And for such a sensitive topic as judging others or even oneself and understanding the moral implications involved, one really needs to take a practical look at how this phenomena of judging itself occurs, the whole mechanism of it. I recall the line from Shakespeare's play on Hamlet, where he writes, "To thine own self be true." What does that mean? We need to ponder on that. See, now it automatically raises a question on morality. Morality is, to my understanding, a question of the precise use of one's faculties and resources. The understanding of what is good or what is bad results from cultivating a constantly refined state of existence. To be true to oneself and be at peace with our own conscience, we need to have a total clarity. And how do we perceive the self clearly? For that, we need a still and settled, peaceful mind. If the waters are muddy, one cannot see what is in the lake. So, also, in order to take some moral standpoint and be confident about judging the self or others with fairness, it is imperative that we have a pure consciousness. The proportion of our inner purity will correspond to our feeling morally secured with our opinions. When we make a heartful, convincing conclusion, there will always be peace. Since the outcome of such an honest and authentic exercise will elevate both the judge and the person under microscope. Our inner compass is subject to our own past programming, or what we call in psychology conditioning. It is as if our inner system functions on the pattern of vibrations from conclusions we arrive with each experience. With each experience, we form opinions. And these opinions come under the way even when the other person has changed. So our judgment fails. Every day we reinforce the previous impressions and or create fresh ones with each new experience. If unchecked, we have a tendency to go towards pleasure and avoid pain. This drives our behavior and choices in life in general. Do you notice how we are constantly swinging between likes and dislikes in our hearts all the time? When we observe something, immediately there is a response in us, like a little bird talking from the heart, say, whispering. We see a rose and we feel, ah, I like this color. We see someone on the street and we feel, ah, this person looks so strange, etc. When we like something or dislike something, the responsive emotional state creates vibrations that have a tendency to settle at a specific point in the area near the heart. So, why discuss these vortexes where such emotions settle? For example, when you're heartbroken, your heart becomes heavier. Close your eyes for a few minutes and see where exactly these emotions are settling in your chest area. Besides heart being heavier, there is still another area of your chest where it settles and you feel really, really uncomfortable. In yoga, it is known as the point of love or point of compassion or the fire point, which is somewhere here, about 4 fingers above the left nipple. So coming back to this aspect of, so why discuss this energy vortex is created by these vibrations created by these emotions. Because when we observe what happens around the heart, we notice that all these vibrations are activated when we feel any associated emotion. When we learn to be aware of such emotions, then we have an opportunity to adjust ourselves in order to clear those from our system. Now we begin to avoid prejudgment as an automatic response to any emotion or situation. So we avoid judging unfairly. Once we learn how to become mere witness to our emotions and develop an attitude of acceptance, there begins the wisdom. Once we start removing these impressions by a practical approach which is adopted by heartfulness practices, one of them being cleaning besides meditation, you see. We notice that our inner space becomes purer each time. Those conditioning that becomes a burden and a baggage becomes thinner and thinner, lesser and lesser. This inner purity leads to a certain feeling of contentment in our heart. As we begin to feel content, it leads to a state of inner peace. This calmness then flowers into a state of compassion. Compassion gives us great courage to be able to have a certain consideration for others in a very naturally loving manner. We then achieve a state of clarity of what is to be done and what is not to be done. This is perfect discernment. What is morally right in a situation and what is not. At this stage, morality may be objective or it may be subjective, but it hardly matters. Now we can think and act with the guidance of the heart, which becomes our inner compass.
It may be, and this is certainly what Socrates thought, that we had, as the old saying goes, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, that we ought to begin with asking ourselves the question, well, what about me? Or in the song by Michael Jackson, I'm looking at the man in the mirror, I'm asking him to change his ways. That is to say, it might be the case that the first thing we need to do is ask ourselves about our own behavior, about our own lifestyles, about our own moral decisions, and only at that point, if once we're completely confident of those, then we could proceed to judge others. But in any event, so this is the first step in Socrates' investigation into this question. He says, you must feel very, very confident that you know that what your father has done is wrong. And his young friend says, oh yes, I know what he did was wrong. And then this is when it comes down to the heart of the dialogue for Socrates. He asks him, how do you know that what he did was wrong? And his young friend tells him, well, I know that what he did was wrong because it's against what the gods would want. And they get into a kind of complicated discussion about whether or not we whether or not we ought to do what the gods think we should do simply because the gods think it is the right thing to do, which if it were simply what the gods think is the right thing to do, we might worry about that a little bit, because how do we know that the gods are right? Or is it that we do what the gods tell us to do because the gods know something, they have an appeal to an external moral standard, that by virtue of their appeal to this external moral standard, they know they can say this is what is right and what is wrong. In which case, it ought not be the gods that we listen to, Socrates points out. It ought to be that external moral standard that we get to know. But how do we have access to that external moral standard, whatever it is? And as Socrates also points out to his young friend, one of the problems with saying, well, this is the way the gods want us to do these things, is that the gods, among the ancient Greeks and in many other cultures, seem to be in constant disagreement with each other. And even if you only have one god, as in some monotheistic traditions, like the Abrahamic tradition, the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, depending upon what text you use, and sometimes even within the one text, God seems to be in disagreement, or at least the text is in disagreement with itself. And it's certainly also true that interpreters of the text are in constant disagreement with each other. So that doesn't look like it's a very secure place to feel so confident that from which to issue judgments.
People often morally judge others by what their holy books, scriptures, and spiritual leaders say. But are scriptures and spiritual leaders always right?
Well, let's begin this exploration with a quote from my Adi Guru, means my Guru's Guru, Lalaji, we call him fondly. He says, and I quote, "All those things on which religion, the Guru, the scriptures, and one's own conscience agree are legitimate." Let me repeat. All those things on which religion, the Guru, the scriptures, and one's own conscience agree are legitimate, and those on which they differ are illegitimate. Religion, the scriptures, the Guru, and one's own conscience never unanimously agree on bad things. This is the test of right and wrong action. If this is not accepted, one should neither do a thing of his own liking nor of others' liking. Unquote. Well, in the Eastern tradition, scriptures fall into two categories. One is the result of what we call Shruti, or revealed knowledge that descends from above. And the other is Smriti, means something that you recall from memory. Indian sages gave a special name to Vedas. They call it Shruti because it was directly received. There is no author attributed to Vedas because when one received such knowledge, it was in a state of egolessness. In higher states of consciousness, one can feel within the heart and so hear or perceive the divine dictations. In the West, it's known as channeling. This hearing, comprehending, and accepting is considered as divine law or divine principle or divine secret. The word Shruti literally means that which is heard. If we were to tune into the higher vibrations of consciousness, then we too would hear the same essence. Smriti, on the other hand, is a remembered law or a code of conduct referred to as the Dharma Shastra. Shruti, being an independent, original vibration, is an authority in itself, and Smriti, being a remembered thing, depends on another authority. Smriti is the understanding that is articulated or recalled as memory by the mind. It is subject to interpretation and commentaries. This may be from spiritual leaders or from books. Shruti is independent, where Smriti is dependent. One is objective and the other is subjective. Nobody can contradict Shruti, whereas Smriti can be contradicted or denied. As Shruti is the authority in itself, it needs nobody's certification. Smriti is less authoritative, and as such it needs certification or another authority. Shruti never alters, Smriti always alters. So you see, in the Indian philosophy, there is a clear distinction in what you described earlier as being debated by Socrates in some manner. Following one's path of duty is called dharma. It is a term with many applications depending on the context. It could mean duty, righteousness, or a destined way, or the truth, or the virtue, that which upholds. Dharma is the path one treads, one's duties, one's responsibilities, one's inner compass in some sort of way. The dharma, shastras especially, are texts with possible prescribed codes of conduct for people. It is a difficult term to translate into English. Sanskrit is such a multi-layered and nuanced language, you see. For example, Moses' 10 Commandments. These are the principles of conduct. Well, while following one's path and deciding what is morally right or not right, one may follow the scriptures, but it requires a certain strength of inner perception. The guru or the guide or a spiritual leader is meant to transfer his spiritual wisdom into the heart of disciples via different means. A spiritual leader of a high caliber can do so without depending on words. He can take the disciple from one spiritual state or one level of consciousness to the next level by clearing the path of obstacles using the spiritual force. In such cases, the able spiritual leader does not necessarily have to be a direct authority by having to convey in words what is right or what is wrong. It is conveyed, as they say, via transmission, without touch, without words, without sound. He is able to lead a disciple to develop such an inner consciousness that the disciple can himself or herself make the right choices at the right time by implementing a high level of discerning intelligence. He prepares them from within, and so that they become strong enough to be masters of their own destinies. So we have a total freedom in designing our destiny. Then, where is the question of the spiritual leader being right, since you are the one guided to make the clear choices via conscience of your own heart?
By the end of this dialogue, Socrates has got his young friend so confused that he is not at all sure that what he's doing is the right thing to do anymore. Nevertheless, it looks like he's going to hurry off to do it, as we often do. That is to say, we often think to maybe pause, ask ourselves, am I so sure I'm in a position to morally judge this other person? Think, I'm not actually so sure that I'm in a position to morally judge this other person. And yet, then we proceed with doing it anyway. We're not doing it necessarily because we have concluded that it is the right thing to do, but we're doing it because we prefer to do it, or it already aligns with some previous bias or prejudice that we have. But then the problem is, well, a couple of problems. One problem is the problem of what we call moral hypocrisy. And that is, are we holding ourselves to the same standard that we are holding others? And this can cut both ways when it comes to the question of judgment. So I often used to tease myself that I was a great champion of tolerance, but I had no tolerance for people who are intolerant of others. And of course, that doesn't work out very well, does it? You know, if I'm truly going to be a tolerant tolerant person, I have to be both tolerant of people like myself who, also consider themselves to be great champions of tolerance. And I also have to be tolerant of people who are intolerant. But to be tolerant of intolerant people is a very, very difficult thing to do. And as I would also tease myself, no one said that this project of being moral was going to be easy. In fact, part of the appeal of the moral project to us might be, or maybe not the appeal, but part of the force, the kind of spiritual force of the moral project might be that, yes, indeed, it is difficult, and we have a tendency to recognize that things worth doing usually aren't the easy things to do. They're more often the difficult things to do.
So should I be judging myself and not others? Or should I judge myself and others? Or should I judge no one at all?
We have to somehow focus on the word tolerance. I find that this word tolerance is not a very nice word. When we say that we tolerate something or someone, it is replete with an underlying sense of rejection rather than insult. But when you love someone very much and very dearly, would you use the term tolerate for them? Would you say, I tolerate you, my darling? How would it make you feel if someone said the same thing to you, that I tolerate you? Well, let's visit Rumi, the Sufi. He wrote, and I quote, listen with the ears of tolerance, see through the eyes of compassion, and speak the language of love. Unquote. Listening with tolerance and seeing through the eyes of compassion and speaking the language of love. It's an incremental evolution in our attitude. In order to avoid what you earlier mentioned as moral hypocrisy, one needs to perhaps begin by respecting one's own self. It means developing self-respect. The journey starts from there, rather from here. With heartfulness way of meditation, we learn to cultivate a state of being reserved or being contained within oneself. It makes us increasingly simpler and authentic in our exchanges, keeping what we say and what we mean the very same. Now, gradually, superfluous talking simply disappears because a meditative mind rejects all superfluities and what is not authentic. A meditative mind will permit us to have such an exchange where we neither consider ourselves better than others nor weaker than anyone. In such a state, we develop forbearance so as to not make hasty judgments. We can avoid driving others to treat us in an untoward fashion. This creates a degree of self-respect. Leading a lifestyle with such dignity and aesthetics that it arouses a feeling of piety in others. Instead of someone judging us negatively, they will be prompted to come to our defense rather. We tend to impose our rules on others and expect them to measure up to our own standards. And what if they too had such high standards for us? Lord Jesus is said to have preached in the Sermon of the Mount, quote, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Beautiful. Judging others is in fact being violent towards others. In fact, this is the symptom of inner unrest. In order to counter this, it is better to focus on constant self-improvement. This can lead to multiple benefits. Constant and never-ending improvement, called kaizen in Japanese culture, is not egoistical in nature. Even in heartfulness way of practices, there are maxims, and one of the last one is all about this: to reflect on our weaknesses, reassuring ourselves with a resolve not to repeat the same again, and make sure whatever we have done nicely, so beautifully, next time the opportunity arises to repeat the same thing, we should be in a position to deliver it in a better way. It's a gradual process of rising above self-centered responses to others, having less and less concern about personal desires, and becoming more accepting of the other, instead of saying more and more tolerating of the other. Then, instead of having high standards to which we measure the behavior of others, we begin to raise our own standards of behavior. It helps us be in a state of loving resonance, not only with ourselves, but others as well. Continuous incremental improvement is not about judging ourselves. It is a way to take stock of what is not yet up to the mark and keep improving with each day. How can we learn to be kind to ourselves? Well, it is by creating a trend of cheerful acceptance of our current situation so that we can deal with it in an appropriate manner. Learning the art of acceptance is a dawning of inner wisdom. It is only when we accept our weaknesses we open to the possibility of transformation. If you deny your weaknesses, how can you work on them? You don't see them. They become invisible. Invisible weaknesses are like invisible COVID. COVID may attack us at physical level, but invisible weaknesses that we ignore will corrode our very moral fabric. Here comes the great role of meditation. It reveals to us our own weaknesses. When we close our eyes and try to feel things in our heart like a mirror reveals to us who we are. Once we become aware of where we require to change or make adjustments, we can take action. So once again, it is a matter of experience and self-discovery. Prejudice feels like a prison where our freedom lies in our own hands. Treat the other as greater than yourself is a safety measure that can create a state of deep humility. Well, we can begin to change, with this meditation where we use it as a mirror, where in the beginning mentioned about Michael Jackson's man in the mirror. So here is the mirror in the form of meditation. No one will ever regret doing meditation.
But let's suppose that I don't have that problem of moral hypocrisy, that I am a person who says something along the lines of, oh no, look, I am oriented reasonably well when it comes to the question of right and wrong. And so I feel like I am in a position to decide who is living well, who is living poorly, who is making a correct decision, who is making an incorrect decision, who's doing the right thing, who's doing the wrong thing. And of course, we do this, don't we? At a minimum, if we are parents, we do this with our children. We try to guide them in this way. If we are teachers or whatever kind of professional that we are, we have a tendency to, an obligation very often, to guide the people we are mentoring. And, you know, this is the right way to behave, this is the wrong way to behave, this is the right action to take in this situation, this is the wrong action to take in this situation. And, you know, as we age, younger people come to us for advice, often of a moral or spiritual nature, and they ask us, you know, what is the right thing to do, or what is the wrong thing to do? And I remember this interview I heard on NPR at one time, and it was with a woman who was reportedly one of the oldest people alive at that point, and she was having a birthday, and it was some birthday, you know, after age 100. I can't remember exactly what age she was. And the reporter perceptively asked her, he said, well, what wisdom can you impart to us, having seen World War I, World War II, lived through all these things, this woman had lived the entire 20th century. After all these years, what wisdom can you impart to us? And she said, and I'll never forget this, she said, well, I don't know. Does one grow wiser with the years? And I thought, right there is an illustration of the fact that indeed one does grow wiser with the years. The wisdom that she had gathered with the years was the doubt about whether or not she had grown wiser with the years. That is, she had opened herself to the kind of the fundamental uncertainty about right and wrong, about how to live. That is, rather than becoming a more judgmental person, she had become, over the years, so much less a judgmental person that she was even questioning the principle of whether one did learn anything over the course of time about how to live. And I just thought that was so beautiful. But also there is the position, adopted by many in our society, that one does know the difference from right and wrong. And as I say, in so many different situations in our lives, we're forced to be this kind of a judge. And how is it that we're going to go about that? Søren Kierkegaard, in his thinking about this subject, when he is talking about the difference between, he divides life into three different categories: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And we may have occasion to talk about those divisions in some other conversation, but when it comes to the particular category of the ethical, which is our subject, he puts his explicator of the ethical specifically in the mouth of a judge. He thinks that to articulate moral questions and answers is to act like a judge, with the kind of objectivity that we expect of a judge, with the kind of deliberation and thoughtfulness that we expect from a judge, but also ultimately with the kind of decision making that we expect from a judge, where at the end of the day the case is settled and the judge says, you are wrong, you are suffering such a punishment, you are right, you are enjoying such and such a reward, or you are guilty, you are innocent, these kinds of categories. So we do indeed have to ask ourselves these questions if we're going to be talking about morality at all. Now, for Kierkegaard, the person who is entitled to make such judgments, and there are such people, are those who have dedicated themselves to the project, like a judge, dedicated themselves to the project of moral decision making and moral evaluation generally. So for Kierkegaard, he would say to someone who's asking our question today, are we entitled to judge others? Well, you have to ask yourself, are you in the area of your expertise? What is it that you are judging about? So just like we were talking about the analogy with the professions, if you, and Plato also, when he's talking about the question of moral judgment, uses this exact same analogy. Plato says, if you want to know about shipbuilding, are you going to go consult someone who's an expert in the art of archery? No, you're going to go talk to a shipwright. And today we might say, if you want to have your house built, are you going to go consult an auto mechanic? No, you're going to go consult an architect and a builder. Similarly, when we're talking about the question of judging others in the moral realm, for Plato, for Kierkegaard, also a great Scottish philosopher we've mentioned before by the name of David Hume uses this analogy. So when it comes to the question of the art of living and the question of doing the right or the wrong thing, are you, if that's what you're making judgments about, are you an expert in those questions? Have you spent your life studying these questions of right and wrong? And it could be that you have. But it may also be that you, before you judge someone else, you want to ask yourself, are there people more expert than me? So for me, when I'm thinking about these questions, for example, I think about the history both of Western and Eastern philosopher, and I go and I look at the people who have spent their lives, dedicated their lives to thinking about those questions. I read their works or I listen to their lectures.
Judges in a court of law are qualified to make legal judgments. But who among us are similarly qualified to make moral judgments?
We talk about general judgments we make in our day-to-day life. Every single moment, we all have this inner chatter. Oh, I like this. I don't like that. That, or answering simply yes or no. They all involve judging. Judging to me is all about arriving at a decision that is morally and legally sound. Let's look at a practical application. Just recently, a young girl came to me asking, Daaji, please tell me how to, I have a big problem. She was proposed, rather her family was proposed. She had two proposals for marriage. In India, this old system still continues. Almost 90% of marriages are fixed by the family members. In her case, both the proposals were so good that created confusion in her mind. Because if one was bad and the other was good, it would have been very easy for her to make a choice. I asked her to meditate with me, and she arrived at a decision with so much of clarity after that meditation. Within less than 1 hour, she finalized, this is the person I would marry. So what is the best way to judge what is good and what is not so good? What is appropriate and what is not so appropriate? I believe that it is always the heart and the intuitive wisdom of our heart that tells us, that guides us. Under most circumstances, it is the heart that filters out no from yes, and precisely more no is filtered out than yes. Because heart is very good in recognizing what is not suitable for us and what is not good for us or what is not so natural for us. For example, when you are trying to speak the truth, you don't have to make much effort. Speaking a lie, suppose someone asks you, what is your name? And you end up saying, I'm Jonathan. But then Clancy would say, oh, you're not Jonathan. Your heart would pump faster at that time, see. That's a signal that you're lying. When you're watching something and your TV, for example, looks so blurred and you ask your spouse, is it really TV is bad? And she said, no, TV is so good. But your heart says, no, I'm feeling a bit different. Your vision is blurred. But as long as you were seeing properly and there was a perfect vision, your heart did not question, it did not give you any signal because it was natural. Moment things become unnatural and what is not good, what is not healthy for you, heart speaks louder. So this subtle inner self that deletes pulls and pushes of desires, greed and ego helps us arrive at the right decisions. Suppose if you had a strong desire that I must marry such and such a person, handsome, healthy, wealthy, etc. It's a desire. May not be the right one for you. When you meditate over this issue, should I marry this person or should I marry that person? It's also trying to make a judgment about the whole situation. It's a vital decision. And it cannot be based on such greed, desires, or your sensual appetite to be satisfied. Desires often act like filter with million holes. Once we stabilize this filter, the inner filter, it can easily remove bad from good. And that's what we call a discerning intelligence. Let me summarize. The ideal situation where perfect judgment is when moral and legal stand form a perfect eclipse. They sync very well. Do you remember the famous story of Solomon the Wise? He was brought to give a judgment when two women were brought to him. They were quarreling over a dispute over a baby that both claimed as theirs. In that case, Solomon dispensed his judgment with wisdom that is still remembered by history. He dispensed justice with such wisdom that he became known as Solomon the Wise. Was he an expert or was he wise? Did anyone ever wonder how Solomon became Solomon the Wise? It is symbolic that his very name Solomon is derived from the word shalom in the Hebrew tradition, which means a man of peace. The legends state that when Solomon was to be crowned as a king, he prayed to God and asked God for wisdom. God was pleased at Solomon's request. He replied that he would grant Solomon's wish because not many people asked for wisdom. Whenever they prayed to God, they asked for things. Most people generally ask God for things like wealth or a long life. So does a fair judgment depend on wisdom rather than expertise? Jonathan Haidt, in his best-selling book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, he claims that the first rule of moral psychology is that intuition comes first and strategic reasoning comes next. It's a questionable attitude, though. Jonathan Haidt says that morality is largely the result of internal predispositions, which he calls intuitions. These intuitions predict what we will be inclined towards with our problems, issues, questions, and making decisions. These predispositions in Heartfulness way are established, are viewed because of our conditioning. And this conditioning is always from the past, be it your personal exposure at individual level, or be it from the family or from community. They view our personality. Well, Jonathan he further says that the rational mind, which the Greek philosophers so idolized, has far less control over our moral frameworks than we might choose to think. Intuition is such a fundamental and a basic and determinative. It is more determinative than reasoning. Being intuitive means you become heart-centered. The more you create a lifestyle that is turned inwards, the more you can become aware of your intuitions. Being intuitive means a marriage between mindfulness and heartfulness. Simply being aware at a mental level is not enough. It is great, but not good enough. Ideal situation is when the logic from here and the inner feelings from the heart form an eclipse of conscience.
For me now, speaking for myself, when people come to me for this kind of advice, for moral advice, I have a tendency to say, well, you know what? I am not an expert on these questions. I don't know. And I do my best not to judge others, even others who are judging other people for the fact of their judging. But then I have a list of experts, of books that I like to refer people to, and there are indeed the very people that we've been talking about in these lectures. I would refer them to Daaji. There's a good living figure. I would another good living figure who I think is a good source for thinking about these questions is the contemporary Tibetan Buddhist Lama Sangzar Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche, like Daaji, a great living source of wisdom on these questions, and like Daaji, someone very hesitant I think to make moral judgments about others. And then the whole history of these Western thinkers we've been talking about. I would say go read a dialogue called the Euthyphro. That's the name of the dialogue that I began by talking about, where Socrates talks to Euthyphro about the question of judging others and piety and whether or not he is entitled to bring a court case against his father. Take a look at Plato, take a look at Soren Kierkegaard, take a look at David Hume, take a look at Immanuel Kant. John Stuart Mill, when he talked about this question, expressed the fact that at the end of the day, we will find that most of our moral judgments, when they are good ones, are moral judgments that we are making for ourselves, about ourselves, because these are areas where we really do have some expertise. But other people, we don't have as much expertise on the question of other people. And when Friedrich Nietzsche talked about this question, and after him the great moral philosopher Bertrand Russell, quoting Nietzsche, said, most moral judgments of others is really just the sublimated desire to be cruel, is what Bertrand Russell said in a famous talk he gave early in the 20th century called How to Be Free and Happy. In this talk, Bertrand Russell said the one thing really above all that we ought to avoid doing if we want to be good people is to avoid judging others, because we really don't understand their situations so well. The old idea of you don't really understand someone until you've walked a mile in her shoes. You haven't walked a mile in her shoes, then maybe you will probably be much less willing to judge her at that point, and you might judge her very differently. And that is one of the questions that we ought to consider when we're thinking about this problem. In order to judge, we really need all of the relevant information, like Kierkegaard's judge. But have we spent the time to gather all of the relevant information about that person's situation such that we are truly in a position to judge someone else? No matter how ignorant or even violent their views may seem to us at first.
People often speak of constructive criticism. But is there also such a thing as constructive judgment?
Well, whenever we are criticized, however positively it may be, most of us take it as negative. Though criticisms can really, really help us if we take those criticisms in a right spirit. Criticisms and judgments can be difficult to face. Criticism need not always be negative. However, judgment often has a negative connotations, often during our day-to-day interactions. I'm not talking about judgment in the court of law. Even simple things like I like this and I don't like this, saying yes or no to your child or to your dear ones, they are all in a way pronouncement of our judgments, isn't it? When we perfect our responses to criticisms, we have the opportunity to turn it into our advantage, provided we face it with poise and a yielding heart. In fact, being criticized or judged, even in an unfair, even in an unfair and unjust manner, by others can become a great advantage when we learn to handle judiciously and rightfully, like a master craftsman with wielding a sharp tool. Every event, every moment of our life can be utilized to propel us on our journey towards our evolution. First of all, we need to fix our goal. For a man who is sailing with his sails unfurled, any wind can be used to steer the boat towards a chosen destination. Let us imagine or recall a scenario where your spouse criticizes you on something, and if you react to her words without much thought or consideration, you may or may not realize your folly, which was being pointed out, and perhaps miss a chance to correct your absurd viewpoint. Take another scenario to think over. Gorbachev, and then the General Colin Powell, who visited Moscow with Defense Secretary Dick Cheney. Point blank, Gorbachev announced, looking straight in Powell's eyes, "General, you have to find a new enemy." General Powell was wonderstruck. He froze because he had gone with then the Defense Secretary Cheney and the whole contingency of almost dozen people to counter argue with Gorbachev. But Gorbachev says, find a new enemy. Now, how are you going to argue with a person who is not willing to fight with you? That is wisdom. Now, let's look at what happens when we develop a noble character. Instead of judging others, we begin to cultivate empathy that can blossom into compassion. A compassionate heart puts others first and does not think about inconvenience or sacrifice, even with total strangers, because helping others is simply being true to its own nature. When we operate from a state of an elevated consciousness, we start helping others as if we are helping ourselves or helping our family rather than a stranger. What happens in deep meditation? We dive so deep within our consciousness that our layers of name, gender, ethnicity, background, qualifications, religions, nationality, etc., they fall behind. They simply dissolve. In that deeply relaxed state, we are able to go beyond all these ephemerals. What remains? There is still an awareness that we exist. At that level, how different are we from others? Differences dissolve. In such states, there is extreme simplicity and softness in the heart. We are filled with love, that there is no more any possibility of hurting others through thoughts or words or deeds, leave alone indulging in judgments. And so we release our need to be critical or judgmental about others. We begin to communicate in such a way that we go from mere words towards a heartful communication. We can share our ideas without sounding judgmental or critical towards others, and come to a level of unity, which is the very hallmark of communities which are built on the foundation of a higher consciousness.
It is important for us to remember that moral principles should inform our societies, and so must inform our societies if we're going to have good societies. So things like the ability to talk to each other, even the insistence that we talk to each other before we make these kinds of decisions as societies, we should never forget how important those principles are. We should never forget that we do have, and we must insist upon, the power to say that our voices matter, not necessarily so much to judge each other, but to explain to each other our particular position so that we are in a better position to understand each other. And that really ought to be the goal. Not so much judging each other as understanding each other. Once we understand each other, then we will be in a better position to conduct the kinds of moral deliberations that might allow us to come to some kind of agreement. Okay, well, I think that's enough on this topic for today. I think that the moral of the story for today is, at a minimum, think twice before we judge someone else, because we probably don't have as much certainty as we think we do, and evaluate ourselves first before we start evaluating someone else, even though that might take a lot more work and might be a lot less comfortable than simply pointing a finger at someone else and deciding that person is wrong and I am right, which is, of course, a nice way sometimes to feel, and a natural way sometimes to feel, but probably also not necessarily the most helpful way to feel, and certainly not the most justified way to feel. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you again, Daaji, for your wonderful contributions to this conversation. I look forward to seeing Daaji and to seeing all of you in our next conversation.
Thank you, Daaji. And thank you, Dr. Clancy Martin, for those valuable insights into this fascinating topic. Thank you also to our listeners and viewers for joining us. Do join us again for the next episode of Compass. Until then, goodbye.